Shalom and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bread, where we discuss the weekly Torah portion. This week's Parashat is Chayei. It is the fifth Parashat of the book of Bereshit, also called Genesis, and it's called Chayei, which means Sarah's life. This year, my message for 2011-12 is called It's Not Good for Man to Be Alone. And we start this week's Parashat. It's an interesting Parashat because I think for some people they may find a hard time getting something out of here because, there's not a lot of material in that sense as far as different things that are happening. You have Avraham who goes and, Sarah. It starts with Sarah's death, even though it's called Sarah's life. It's really about Sarah's death. It talks about her death, and then Avraham needs to find a place to bury his wife. And so he goes and he talks to Ephron. He talks to the people to ask Ephron the Hittite if he could buy his cave from him, and he offers to, give it to him for free. And he says, no, I'll pay you. And you go down through here. The next story is a servant of Avraham being sent to find Yitzhak a wife, then comes back, and then you end up with Avraham dying and Ishmael dying. And it gives some genealogies. So one of the things that struck me about this week's Parashat, in looking at it, I always try and meditate. I look at what's happening and I try and see what's really happening here. What's the structure? What does this mean? And what I saw that we really have, when you talk about Sarah dying, you talk about Avraham, we say, well, how does, he's one of the central characters, even though it's about Sarah. How does her death impact Avraham? And what is this about? Because what happens to Avraham is his wife is a helper. And it reminded me of that phrase, it is not good for man to be alone. And I thought, well, here's Avraham. He's alone. Sarah, his wife died. That's a horrible thing to have to go through and to imagine going through, especially after all, the stuff they've been through, some tough times. And now Sarah's dead. And Abraham's looking for a place to bury her. Then you say, because you're looking for the thread of what connects all these points. What is it trying to tell me? And one of the things I see next, you see, is he sends, it's again also about a wife, when he sends a servant to find a wife for Yitzhak, his son. And there's this whole test that the wife has to go through to show the sign that she's the right one for Yitzhak. And again, you have at the core, this is a helper for Yitzhak. And more importantly, a focus on that there's a test that isn't just go grab me a wife. It wasn't go grab me a wife from around here. He specifically didn't want his son to have a wife from this area where he was. He wanted him to go back to his homeland and take a wife from his own people. And so he goes back, and then there's a test, with asking for a drink of water, and then asking to see the woman who would say yes, and I'll water your camels also, was going to be this thing. So we see that this is about the importance of a wife, even so much that there's standards and qualities looked for and tests given before we just determine this isn't anything that goes. And Sarah was Abraham's wife and helper, and so now he's doing this. And what we really see is that this is with the death of Abraham and the death of Ishmael and the death of Sarah, we see that it isn't, even though there's a lot of death going on here, it's really about life and who's going to be your helper and how are you going to live life. So I noticed that this is a pattern that we see that really it talks a lot about genealogy, and what does that have in common? Well, it's talking about the kids that you've had and when you died and the wives. Ultimately, that's what is the element of this week's Parashat. So we're going to start off just talking about the wife helper. And we see that already that Abraham loses his helper. Women were created to be a helpmeet for man. And you see that when Adam was created, he looked around and he sees everybody has kind of a partner or a helper or something like this. And there's none for Adam. And also, a lot of people might not think, but there was no way for Adam to multiply. So that brings up a good question, which was, if he's seen these other are these other animals, and they're male and female. A couple of mind-bending, trails to go down is first to think, did Adam see any of them give birth before he realized he was alone? Because that could really impact it too. I mean, it's different if there's a male or female, but, what was then the great question? What animal or what thing gave birth? When was new life created out of the life that was created originally? When did that first happen? Was it an animal? Was it a bird? Was it a bee? I don't know. Did he see that going into it? But at the end of the day, because it talks about them going forth and multiplying, and you can't multiply if you don't have this way to reproduce. And at that point, to put it in perspective, Adam didn't have a way to reproduce at that point, as far as we know. So it's this interesting thing about what brought about this creation of this wife and this helper, and then what was that she was for him, that he had all these things to do and tasks, and he was going to have a helper, and this was his wife. And we see that it really matters too when we get into the influence. And there's really two concepts here. One is that the wife is a helper. Now, what about children? What is the function of a child to a parent? Well, it allows you to, when we look at these basic roles, it allows you to influence somebody. One of the great blaring things that you see about kids is that they're susceptible to influence. So in particular, they mimic, and they're supposed to mimic their parents. The reason why Mashiach was the son of the living Elohim is because you could see through his son all the traits of the Father, all the commandment keeping and all that. He said, not my will, but thy will. And as Mashiach said, he said to the people who said, we're the sons of the seed of Abraham, he said, if you were Abraham's seed, you would have Abraham's works. So this is going to show that children, number one, are influenceable. They're like a sponge. And more importantly, they're supposed to be around their parents so that they can sponge off their parents and ultimately the will of their father. Because if the wife is doing the will of the father, then that child who's in that environment of a mother and a father, ultimately what the child's really seeing is the will of the father. And his will should be the will of his father and ultimately the will of Elohim. And this is how the structures of family work. So you have your wife who's your helper. And the wife is also a spreader of the influence because she helps raise the kids, and so spreads the will of the father into those, make sure he teaches those to the kids. So what we see is that influence isn't just an influence. By transferring your influence or your will to your children, then when you die, your will remains on earth, and it continues to spread and go and transfer. And if you look at families, in general, over time, the population that started with Adam and Hava, Adam and Eve, eventually spread out, right, and spread the world. And that's because generally, someone's going to have a couple of, obviously to multiply, you need to have 2 or more sons at a core rate, because that's, you spread your will to them. When you have a daughter, she marries, but then she's under the will of her husband. And it gets a little bit tricky as far as that goes, of how that lines up with the will of her father also. And hopefully they're in alignment. But ultimately, her husband becomes then over her and head of her. So, and you also go into, ultimately then, that man who married your daughter, he should be doing the will of his father. So you're talking about another man's, ultimately that bloodline, it's another man's will. And you are in charge of the will of your, you're that little knot in the tree limb that's responsible for that branch. The will all the way goes through that bloodline. Ultimately, ideally would be the same, and ultimately, ideally, should be from God when you get into spiritual bloodlines and stuff. But the whole point here is that it even says in the Torah, it says that YHWH made the covenant with Abraham, it says, because he knew he would diligently teach his children. So again, that's that continuation of life. And this is why the 5th commandment, honor your father and mother, is tied into that your days may be long in the land that YHWH gives you. So the land represents that flesh, and that they would be long means that you're only going to live, say, 70 years or however long it's been appointed to you to live. That's your life in the flesh, in the land. This is the land. So in order for that to continue, if you have a son, then he does your will and he learns your will, then even though you're dead in the flesh, that's the remnant that you leave behind, and that your will is still here in the earth. And it's a whole other subtopic, but it's very interesting when you look at that in accordance with the Torah, because Elohim, God's will, is still here on earth. As we live out those commandments, we become, just as Mashiach said, then you would have his works. The physical works in the earth of the Torah not only represent the Father, they keep the Torah alive in the flesh. So, and if you take it one more step beyond that, that's almost kind of a model of resurrection of the Torah and ultimately resurrection of Mashiach, because as we live out his Torah, we make the Torah alive in the flesh again, which is what he represented, and it lives on earth even, so in a way it's almost a model that death couldn't overcome Mashiach, because he still has people, as long as there's people living the Torah on the earth, he's still here present, manifesting himself in the earth. So this is also very fundamental reason why it's important, and gives more meaning to why we keep the Torah, that we don't just go to the grocery aisle and pick a kosher food because we have to, but you're representing the living Torah when you do that, that it's still alive and on earth, and it's still functioning here on a physical manifestation here on earth of the spiritual things of God. So it's very deep, it's very interesting. But getting back to this concept of children, is that children allow you to present and to pass on your influence and maintain your influence, and even expand your influence. When you have multiple sons, then it expands and they can have multiple, and sometimes it diminishes. But the big thing with Abraham is he was worried that his bloodline, right? He didn't have an heir to inherit his things, and if he died and you have no sons, then that piece of the branch is dead. It's finished growing. It's not going to, maybe one branch is spread into 2 pieces, and then this one spreads into 3 pieces. These are like you're having sons. But this part of the branch, it just finishes right there. That's like the model of a man who doesn't have at least 1 or 2 sons. 2 sons is multiplication, 1 is continuation of life and the will. So when we see that it's not good for man to be alone, we're talking about a woman, becomes like that knot in that tree that then has children, and like 3 branches can split out of that knot, or at least even 1. So when we see the mechanics of what is the role of a woman, because it's so tied to having children, I felt like we had to take a diversion here and talk about this, to understand what really happened in this week's Parashat. So Sarah died, and Abraham lost that helper. The good thing is, though, that she did have Yitzhak, so life had continued on. It wasn't a destruction of his life. In a way, then we go to the next level, the final level, because there's 3 branches here I want to talk about. And the third is friends. What are friends? So if a wife is really a helper, and children is how you pass on your influence, then friends create this interesting thing. Like if you look in your own world, right, there's an inner world and an outer world. Your inner world is about how you interact, like you share your will with your wife. She honors you by observing your will and helps train the children, and you both influence the children, which ultimately means that the father is influencing, with the help of the wife, the children. Now this is the goal. Like it says, train them up, in the way, I can't remember exactly how the wording is, for some reason I can't think of it, but it's train up your child basically in the way they should go, and when they're old, they'll not soon depart from it. And this is like the Torah. It's saying, this is what you're supposed to. It teaches the function that while they're young, you're supposed to be training them up in these things that you want to continue. And when you're gone, you can no longer sit there and tell them, hey, don't do that. They had to have gotten it by the time you die, so they can carry on. Now they're carrying on without your help, and that creates this pattern, right? So it's funny that Sarah dies in the same Parashat that Abraham dies, because in a way, right, Sarah, the two were becoming one. Sarah is Abraham's helper, and a part of his help to influence dies when Sarah dies. So he's diminished. Now he picks up another wife, and this again gives him more help because he's not done yet spreading his influence. He has children, he does this and that, But what happens at the end is Abraham dies. So Abraham dies, but you see, he isn't left behind nothing. He's left Yitzhak behind, and he's given all that he had, and he gave gifts to his other children. So he's left something behind, and that's important. And that's the model of a wife. The wife is the catalyst of letting you expand your influence and leave something behind. And so we look at friends and we say, what do friends do? So this is an internal thing. You're working on learning from God, His will, so that you can teach it to your wife and your kids. And then when you pass away, that will hopefully got stronger and better and more righteous. And you've taught your kids to study, and they're going to take it even to another step. So hopefully that branch flourishes and becomes, a million branches that bear so much fruit for the tree, ultimately, which is Elohim. So we see this and we say, what then is interesting about friends' relationship is that that's all an internal. You have total control as the husband, right? You work with your wife. You work with your children. I always say that the only people that God really gave you rule over, unless He appoints you as a king or anything like that, but ultimately is your wife and children. Like everybody wants to change everybody else. They want to convince everybody else and influence everybody else to think like them, and they think they're right, so they got to force their opinions on you. But the reality is there's actually a biological way that this is most susceptible, and that's your children. Ultimately, even more so than your wife, because your children are a part of you. So, it's like you can control, to quote Michael Jackson, you want to make a change, look at the man in the mirror, right? Because you're the only person who really can't deny yourself. Like if you decide, hey, you know what, I want people, it's horrible how people don't care about the poor. Well, you can complain about it all you want. Or you could personally stand up. There's no resistance. You can remove your own resistance. Doesn't mean there isn't any there, even from you fooling yourself. But you can demand the removal of resistance on yourself. Get out of your chair and go give $5 or give something to the poor or help somebody. You can do that right now. Now, with others, you got to convince them, and that may or may not happen. It's ultimately their decision whether they want to believe you, be influenced by you. But when you deal with your kids, you have something that is a biological, hardwired process where they mimic their father. They have the best chance to mimic you and be influenced by you, and they're more susceptible to being influenced by you than anybody else. And you get to do it ultimately when they're young, when they don't even have any really a will to rebel against you. Because the first words they learn, they're learning from you because you're speaking to them and they're observing you, and you can control that environment to where, if you sit them in front of the TV and they're using the F word, then guess who they're going to, as they're learning the world, they're going to think that that's normal, and they're going to try and copy that because they're trying to engage the world and mimic it. But if you create that environment where you spend a lot of time with your kids, they're going to mimic you, and you can have a better chance. Because when they get older, if you didn't do your job right and they get away and you let everybody else influence them, then you're going to have a hard time being the main influence in them, and you may lose them altogether. They may just slip right out of your hands as you're trying to go after them. I see that all the time when people's kids just go off and they go, and they're totally different than their parents. And you see it with religious people, and they're like, I can't understand why he's going crazy. And I would think that we gave him a great environment and all that, but somewhere along the line, they didn't do what they needed in order to be the key influencer, and also for that kid to want that influence later in life. So it depends how you do it. But what we see with friends that's so interesting is that friends give us another shot, right? We're all working in our bubble, right? Influencing ourselves with the Word of God and then spreading it to our wife and kids, and that's under your house. But now you got your neighbor, right? And they're doing the same thing. They're working on their relationship with God and their influence on their wife and relationship and their influence on their kids. And you get to compare notes, and this is really where fellowship is. So if a wife is a helper and the children are about influence, then friends are about fellowship. And that allows you to see how they interact with their helper and how they influence their kid. And that gives you another witness, another perspective to look at. And this is why quality matters. I take this back to standards that when he was looking for, the servant was looking for a wife for Yitzhak, he said, I mean, when you break it down, you see that she had to be willing to not just do the minimums. Like, I'm not going to just, I mean, it was her water. She lowered it in the well. She's taking it back to her family for her, not just herself. You know, she walked all the way to the well. She's doing all this. And then you're like, hey, I want you to walk all the way to do all this, lower your pitcher down, bring it up. And that was for you. I want you to give me what it was yours, which is kind of the model of charity, right? I mean, so many people don't want to help somebody because they're like, hey, you know, you see it in the politics right now. Everybody's like, oh, you know, the lazy people on welfare or this, that, and the other. You know, why should I go? I'm working hard here. Why should I give that to somebody else? You see, and that shows us the model of charity underlying isn't about giving away what you didn't work for. That's easy. You know, it's the fact that you walked all the way to the well, dropped the pitcher down, your pitcher that you maybe made, or your father, you know, passed down to you. This is all your things. You drew the water up, and your muscles and your time was invested in all that. And for someone who's sitting up there, who doesn't have a bucket, didn't lower it into the well, didn't crank that thing back up, you did all the work, and they want to come up, and how dare they ask you for a drink? You know, and that's the perspective you have to look at it. So all that comes up, and they pull the water up, and he says, hey, you know, can I have a drink? And not only does she give of herself and of the work that she did to give to a total stranger, but then she gives abundantly. She's willing to give it to the camels, right? Here's a servant, and even his animals, which are the lowest down there, she's willing to help the lowest with her work. It's a great model for charity, and one that I think our country and all around the world needs to look more at charity. Right now there's almost as the Bible says, the love of many grows cold, you know, will grow cold in the latter days. And you look at this, it's almost like this anger against the poor, and it always, you know, paints them into being these lazy people taking advantage of stuff. Why don't they just make it for themselves? And I just can't agree with that, and I don't believe the Torah supports those kind of concepts. It's not only for those people who can't do for themselves, but it's also something to say that I did do it all myself, and my work brought this, and I'm still willing to give it to others and share with others. I mean, that reveals a compassionate and loving heart, and one that's willing to help others, that isn't so selfish. It's the opposite of being selfish. So the goal is it's good for you, even if they could have got, you know, if the servant could have went and found a bucket, lowered it down himself. I mean, can you imagine if Rivka came and said, hey, this guy can go find a bucket, you can go buy it, you got camels. We know later that he's got gold and all this. It's like, well, why don't you go buy yourself a bucket? Well, what if she copped an attitude on him? I was like, hey, you go buy yourself your own bucket and you lower it down. I'm not going to enable you to be lazy. I mean, it's ridiculous. The fact is that charity, and that is a great thing that we learn about Rivka, that she was willing to go beyond. Number one, do more than she was asked. Number two, she had charity. Here's and was willing to work harder. And all these things are things that, you know, would be good for a wife to do. You don't want a wife who barely does the will of her husband, just like with righteousness, just like with Mashiach. You don't want someone who's just being compliant because they have to keep the Torah. You want someone who exceeds that and says, you know what? How can I be exceedingly righteous and helpful and charitable? And these are great things. So there's a standard. So when we look at our wife, one thing it teaches us that we should have a standard, that there's qualities that are so profound that make a great wife. It's going to make great children. These are things you can teach to your children to do more than they're asked for and all this. This is how to be a great servant, a great wife, and a great friend. How many people look at their friends and they're, you know, if you ask them to help you, they would. But they're not necessarily thoughtful, going out of their way saying, gosh, I think I kind of saw a need that you might have, even though you didn't even ask me. I mean, looks, you know, I'd love to come over and help work on your yard there. Looks like with all the kids, maybe you don't have time to do that. And can we help you out that way? It's like, whoa, yeah, sure. I hadn't thought about that. You know, those are great traits. So fellowshipping matters because we get to peek on other people's life paper. And this really teaches us the pattern of the Torah. The Torah is getting the peek on other people's paper that God has put his stamp of approval. Here's some people so exceptional that of all the universe and generations, God chose to mention some of these guys by name, like Moshe and Noah and Isaiah and Jeremiah and, some of these great people, David, King David. You have these people where we get to peek in on their lives and learn from them. They get to influence us and help us. And we can have fellowship with them by studying the Torah and ultimately fellowship with God. He's the greatest person to be friends with. You want to be a bestie with somebody. God's a pretty good choice because he's going to influence you, right? So, and that's going to help you influence your wife and your children. But God's the greatest influencer. But Satan is another influencer. And selfishness is ultimately being self-serving. You can influence yourself in bad ways. But this is about, fellowship is about sharing experiences and influencing each other for the good, not hopefully for the bad. See, all of our friends influence us good and bad. Our wife can be a good or bad thing in a relationship, in the household. And we can have moments of good and moments of bad. And kids can be good or bad in our house and in the world is what we're preparing them for, and into the house of God. And that's what you see in this week's Parashat. You see the power of the wife, the children, and friends. It's the helper that influence. Help and influence. This is what Rivka did, right? She helped. And ultimately is going to influence the whole world, because by her being a great helper, by helping that servant and his camels, what she ended up doing is being the wife of Yitzhak, who would have Yaakov, who would have Yisrael, who would be the redemption and one of the great values of this world, that possibly, just like with the story last week of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, if there was 10 righteous, it would save the whole city. How important are those 10 righteous? See? How important is Rivka? Because if it wasn't for Rivka and it wasn't for Yisrael, right? Yisrael's like that pearl in the oyster. The oyster by itself, not worth anything. It's an unclean thing. But it has something of great value inside it. And as long as Mitzrayim, Egypt, had Israel in it, right? And same as having Lot in Sodom, it was sparing the city until he came out. When he came out, the value's not there anymore. Now judgment will come and destruction will come. So Israel's so important to the world. It's the apple of YHWH's eye. And so what are they restraining? What destruction are they restraining? Because they're simply here in this earth to the rest of everybody else. And so we see that wouldn't be possible if Rivka wasn't helpful. So being helpful, charitable, is a foundational thing that's keeping, this world together. And that's a strong message that we need to get. So we'll go with the last point of this, which is life more abundantly. So what is this all about? It means that, it means quality matters. There's a crazy balance between conformity and diversity. It's about being social. It means your wife, that's that person who's close to you, who you interact with. Very important. Qualities are very important key role. And then your children, very important role, how you influence those children. Your influence matters. And your influence spills out to the people you're social with. And so first thing I'll say is get social. Think about these relationships that you have and what they're doing, positive or negative. Because Israel ultimately is about a society, and wickedness was to be removed from the society, and YHWH's influence was to run throughout all of the society. And so we look at our own lives and we can see, who are our friends? Have we given them a test? Do we know their strengths and their weaknesses? Do we surround ourselves with quality people? And if not, that's okay. We have a beautiful, social media sites like Facebook and Twitter and all these other different things allow us to meet people we would have never met in our entire life. We didn't live by them. We would have bumped into them. We wouldn't have shared a job with them to where we got to know them. I mean, it was so hard to build relationships now, and life has changed so dramatically. I've met some wonderful people online that I would have never come across in my life. I would have lived and died, never met them So get social so that your life, see what these things do is children and all this, you learn from how you influence people and how they help you. And that's your household. And when you have a friend, you can learn new things that you could have never learned in your own world, in your household. So you get to share experience and kind of influence each other. And then you take it to a further thing and you say that the more of this you have, it says there's wisdom in the counsel of many. And the more quality friends you have, the richer your life is. The more quality influences you put in your children's life, whether it be the TV shows they watch or books they read or this Torah study they do, the richer you're making their life. The more quality your social life, the more quality your life. And I don't think people give that, understand the power of that. We have a depth and a richness that change our experience and changes our life. Our life, you can have a palette, right? You can have a painting you're doing with just 2 colors, and you have to, be an exceptional artist, but you're going to be limited eventually. And then adding one more color adds a whole multitude of things you can do. And then a richness and a depth, and having a bigger palette. It's just like a camera. You got the 1 megapixel, it's like, you kind of make out what it was. Then you get to 2 and 3 and you see more details. And then you get to like 10 megapixels. You can zoom into the picture and see things in the background you couldn't even see with the naked eye, just looking at the photo. I mean, it's incredible. And that's the richness of our lives, both mentally and spiritually. And that's what being social is about. It's about understanding those relationships. It is not good for man to be alone. And so we have to understand that the opposite of being alone is being social. And that means looking at relationships that you have that are your closest ones and building new relationships. And it isn't about conformity. It's actually a balance. Some people only have friends like them. And they're missing out on a lot of things in the world. And they're missing out on someone calling their BS and challenging their bad idea. They'll never know because they didn't look beyond, didn't surround themselves. They pushed away people who were different, right? And it also doesn't mean being totally different, because then you have no support. You see, the support is, it's nice to have people who believe like you have, or like you do, but it's also nice to have friends who don't, that challenge you and stretch you. If you want real balance, you need to have the both of those in your life. So it's not good for man to be alone. And what I learned from this week's Parashat is that Abraham, had God, which is ultimately like the book of life. There's all these things he can tap into, and he influences children with the will of God, which is what we're supposed to do. But we need to look around at our relationships, expand them, meet new people, and we can do that with great technology. So, till next time, I'm going to say Shabbat Shalom, and get social and add some more depth and richness to your life. Shalom.